Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Energy Realities Podcast, our weekly discussion of major energy issues impacting the globe. I'm here with my co-host, Dr. Tammy Nemeth, who is in the UK today, Stu Turley, who is down in Abilene.
Yep, close enough.
Prettiest place that I've ever seen. And we have with us today special guests from the UK as well, Kathryn Porter, noted energy expert. Kathryn is an independent energy consultant. She holds a master's degree in physics and an MBA, is associate member of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Energy Studies Executive Council. She's been with us twice before, and we are thrilled to have you with us again today. Kathryn, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be back.
Yes, back and in the great state of Texas, I must say. Tell everyone where you are today.
Well, today I'm in San Antonio. In the past week, I've also been in Houston and Austin. And then on Thursday, I'm heading to New York City before spending a couple of weeks in Canada.
Wow, man, you're going all over. Except for North Texas, you're not up here in the Metroplex. I'm highly disappointed you didn't visit my part.
Austin was as far north as I went this time.
Well, that's probably as far north as anybody really needs to be in Texas, quite honestly. That's where I grew up, down in South Texas. God's country, as I like to call it. And so I'm stuck up here in North Texas because that's where my family is. But it's not really home country for me up here. It's a little cold. Stuart, how are you today?
Absolutely peachy. We've had a couple bear sightings around my place up here in Oklahoma, and it's kind of weird.
Oh, you're in Oklahoma. I'm sorry.
Hey, I travel. I would have preferred to have met with Kathryn in Texas, but I'll tell you what, this is cool. I would have rather done an interview live with you, so that would have been fun. This is a fantastic report, and I'm looking forward to this discussion.
And Tammy, how is everything you're in the UK? Yes, that's right.
I'm in the UK today.
In Keir Starmer's paradise today.
Wow, it's just peachy. Yeah,
well,
it's a
cloudy a month over here.
Cloudy day. So, well, there's a lot of cloudy days in England. I know that.
Yeah.
In Texas, we haven't had many clouds. We're in a dadgum drought. I'm sick of it. Anyway, let's stop with the preliminaries here. Let's get going because we're here today to talk about a new study Kathryn published, last week, right? It was released just last week. Electrification, can the grid cope? It is a very detailed report on the mess that's being made of the power grid in the UK by the current administration there. And Kathryn goes into detail about the causes and the likely effects and the consequences for the public between now and 2030 and beyond. And Kathryn, tell us about why this report at this time? What was the motivation?
So this was commissioned by one of my clients. This is now the third report actually I've written for this particular client. And they wanted me to explore what would be the impact on the British power grid of the government's plans for electrification. And then I also added in some commentary about AI data centers because they've been designated critical national infrastructure. And so that I thought was a relevant thing to also consider when we're looking at what sort of shape the grid might be in the coming years. And so I set out the various policy background that we have across industry, transport and heating for decarbonisation. Electrification is seen as the primary role now. We had a couple of hydrogen trials for domestic heating that got cancelled last year because of public opposition. And I think that was a tipping point effectively against the use of hydrogen. So it's been sort of downgraded in the official forecasts. So electrification is seen as the main road to decarbonisation. And I believe that would add about 7 to 10 gigawatts of demand by 2030, and then you could get another 7 or so from AI data centers. To put that into context, our typical peak demand in the winter's 45. So very exceptionally, we can go higher than that. We went actually to 51 a couple of weeks ago, but that was unexpected and higher than the system operator had predicted for the winter. 45 thereabouts is what we'd expect on a weekday evening in the winter. So to gain an additional sort of 15 or so gigawatts is obviously quite significant in that context. Yeah. The good news in my report is that it's almost certainly not going to materialize. The actual driving narrative around demand at the moment is deindustrialization, which is causing demand destruction. And it's my view that AI data centers will be built, but they will not connect to the power grid. They'll connect to the gas grid and build their generation behind the meter. And then the bad news is that even without additional demand from electrification and data centers, we're going to struggle to avoid rationing unless we deal with the firm power retirements that we're likely to see. We've got 5 gigawatts of nuclear that we know will definitely leave the grid by March of 2032. At the moment, it's March 2030, but I think we'll see a bit of an extension there. We do have some new nuclear being built and an anticipation of maybe some open cycle gas being built, which I think more or less will offset the nuclear closures. But the real risk that nobody's talking about is within the gas fleet. A third of our gas power stations were built in the 1990s, another third in the 2000s. And they just don't appear to have had the sort of upgrades that would allow those lives to be materially extended. In the report, I look at 2, Peterhead, which opened in 2000, and Langage, which opened in 2010. Both have been having some quite significant reliability issues. And in fact, I'm looking for funding to do a follow-up report that will do a deeper dive into the at-risk assets and go through. So in Europe, we have something called REMIT, which is a market transparency reporting. Everybody has to report when they're going off on maintenance, whether that's planned or unplanned. So you can get quite a lot of information about plant reliability from that. So that would be sort of the next step, would be to really dig into those data and be able to develop even more sophisticated conclusions around when we might start to see these assets coming off. And Peterhead's particularly interesting because there are only 2 synchronous generators in Scotland, Peterhead and Torness, which is one of the nuclear power stations, which we know is going to close. So I think Scotland's going to be in big trouble. I struggle to see how they're going to form the grid in Scotland. And the system operators got various plans for things like synchronous condensers and StatComs and so on to try and support the grid. But I do wonder if you don't have anything forming the grid in the first place, how that's going to work out. People are focusing very much on energy and saying, yes, well, there's lots of wind in the north of Scotland, so they'll have enough energy. That's not entirely true. On low wind days, obviously, they'll have to import from England. But I just wonder if the further north you go into Scotland, the further away from the English border, where all the synchronous generation is, how they're going to keep that grid stable. They already have voltage oscillations that they're struggling to damp. Right. So, that's only if you lose.
That was what caused the blackouts in Spain last year, right?
Well, and also
the loss of inertia.
Well, so it's not just inertia, though. It's voltage control, and that's locational. Yeah. So inertia is broadly the same everywhere across the grid, but voltage isn't. And the Spanish grid operator came back a couple of months ago asking for emergency powers to control voltage in the south because they'd let so many of their synchronous generators close and that they're struggling to do that. And the trouble is, and I have a bit of a hobby horse about this, that there's been a disconnect on the engineering side, and people have treated reactive power and VARs as if they have a physical reality and they can be commoditized, and therefore any current bearing device can provide them. And this just isn't true, right? They're not reactive power isn't a real thing to start with. It's just an abstraction of complex numbers. And really, we should bring everything back to current and voltage because those are the 2 things that are actually real in the grid. So we should talk about current that goes to power loads and current that goes to support voltage. And if you think about what inverters can do, well, so synchronous generators do this for free, obviously within limits. If you start pushing them to the limits of their thermal capacity, then obviously that you can't go past that. But they do it for free because they're both mechanically coupled to the grid and electromagnetically coupled to the grid. So they will automatically respond to voltage variations that they see at the terminal without even having to have, control equipment. It's a natural feature. A little bit like Newton's first law of motion. In fact, something a force pushes against it and you get an equal and opposite force. But with inverters, you don't get that. With an inverter, if they want to support voltage, they have to divert current from powering loads. So not only do you then have quite an economic challenge, and this is what the Australian grid operators have identified, is that they haven't quite squared the circle on how you deal with the economics of something that used to be for free and now isn't. And it takes a lot of current as well to support that voltage. It's not just marginal. But also, there are hard limits to what semiconductors can deliver. And you could, if you had an inverter-dominated grid where all of your assets were programmed the same way because they had to comply with the grid code, and then you have a voltage disturbance, you could then trigger a frequency excursion because they're all taking current away from powering loads to support the voltage, and then you crash the grid that way. So there's a huge amount of gaps here in the technology, and people who just say, oh, well, it's fine because batteries will do it all. They just don't get it. And it's because we've fallen into this trap of thinking that reactive power is a commodity that anything can deliver, and it just isn't.
Do you think Ed Miliband understands all that?
Oh, no, not at all.
Does he understand any of it?
And so I don't think there's more than around half a dozen people within the system operator that really understand that. And I've been going around, whenever I meet people. I met somebody from ERCOT the other day, and I asked, I don't ask them in the context of, testing them. But so the guy I spoke to, he was very knowledgeable. He has an engineering background and he got it straight away. And in fact, it's an area they've been working on. So I wasn't telling him anything he didn't know. But it's amazing how many people you speak to. I've discussed this with senior people within our regulator. And, he was repeating some of the things his engineers were telling him. And I was like, that's just not true in terms of how the engineering works. Things about reactive power is subject to heat losses and things like that. It just isn't. Yes, a little bit at the margin. You have some eddy currents in the magnets and so on, but not in the same way that you get heat losses on active power when it's going through loads. So it's a real knowledge gap. And in Britain, we've made it way worse because we've actually separated everything. So the ownership of the grid and the operation of the grid are completely separate. That was supposed to be to remove conflicts of interest. But then you end up with this disconnect between the equipment and the people running the equipment. And that's where stuff starts to fall through the gaps.
Tammy, I wanted to highlight something from your report that is connected to this, because one of the things that happened last year that you also investigated was the need for these substations to be upgraded, and that there's these different infrastructure challenges, like the low voltage networks. In your report, you say 45% of substations will need to be upgraded by 2035. And there's been these delays and kind of dragging out how long can we preserve substations and whatnot. But then there's connection delays. And then there's how are you going to get these components and whatnot when there's these long waiting lists. And I think one of the important parts of your report is that you talk about how there's all these aspirations and there's all these goals without real means of achieving things like in a realistic manner. So one of the things that you said was like, well, if we need these upgrades and there's a waiting list to get stuff, why aren't we in the queue? And I just wondered if you could shed a little bit of light about the state of substations and all these different issues in the UK.
So this, so the supply chain issue affects generation as well as network equipment, and the substation constraint has been known for some time. I was writing a couple of years ago about there being 4-year lead times for super transformers, and so here in the US, actually, I think Hitachi's just building a transformer factory because the the equipment shortage is so acute that it actually makes sense to go and build a factory to build the equipment rather than just wait for the existing supply chain to deliver it. We need to do the same in Britain, except we don't really have any steel production left. So it's
deindustrialization, right?
Yeah.
Well, exactly. If we were smart, we'd also build a factory to build gas turbines. But again, we don't have the steel capability. So I worry quite a lot about asset life on the grid, and I've discussed this a fair amount with Ofgem. So if you look at the latest price control that was just published before Christmas, they allocate. So our networks are regulated monopolies. So they're subject to a price control, and the regulator decides what their CapEx program will be over the next 5 years, because that determines what their revenues will be and what they can recover from consumers. And they divide that into two categories: load, which is new connections, and non-load, which is legacy equipment. And then things like cybersecurity and so on fits within the non-load bucket. And so they consistently downgrade the amount of money allocated to the networks for non-load CapEx. Each successive price control, they've done the same. And in the draft determination, it was radically cut. They then sort of add some back when they get to the final determination. But if you look at the way they're treating the allocation for legacy assets, they basically rely on the end-of-life scores provided by the network operator. Now, National Grid Transmission has, so their end-of-life scores go from 0, which is this is brand new, to 100, which is this needs replacing now. The transformer that caught fire at North Hyde, which caused the outage at Heathrow Airport in March, that had been installed in, I think, 1968. And it had an end-of-life score of, I think it was 12.5. It was either 12.5 or 16.5, but very low. Now, Ofgem's only allocating CapEx for replacements if the end-of-life score is 75 or over. So I think there's a huge potential gap here between what the network operator says the end-of-life score is, and it seems to me to be completely indefensible to have an end-of-life score in the teens, mid-teens for an asset that was installed in 1968. And if you do have assets of that age, you need to be really, really on top of the maintenance. And they had 2 outstanding maintenance issues at that substation, one of which was the failure that led to the whole incident. So, and then they lost 2 transformers because the one immediately adjacent to it suffered from heat damage, and so that had to be replaced as well. So I think that we have a growing problem with the age of the assets on our grid. There was a big spike in investment in the 1970s, and a huge proportion of what we have was installed pre-1980. And so it just inevitably is going to need replacing. The whole focus that Ofgem has is on connecting new stuff. And they say, well, we don't tell everyone to ignore legacy, but it's obvious if your regulator is focusing so strongly on connections, then you within the network company, you'll put your best people on connections. That's where you'll devote your resources and your energy. And so you end up with, then the regulator complains that the business case for the legacy asset replacement and so on is inadequate. But then it's probably because they're not giving it the same focus, because they know the regulator itself doesn't have that focus. So I don't think they're really understanding the feedback loop there in terms of how their actions reinforce that. But I think actually the big challenge of the connections, which everybody's experiencing, this is not just in Britain, will work out well in Britain, because we don't want this stuff connecting to the grid, because the more of it that connects, the more problems it causes. We would be far, far better off just upgrading our gas power stations, upgrading the legacy grid infrastructure, and leaving it at that. That would be the best deal for consumers.
Yeah, instead, because you end up having these 2 parallel grids going. One, so you end up with double, but it doesn't really account for double, because half the time the other one doesn't work. So it's like this added expense.
We've just had the new auction round for the wind subsidies announced last week. and they've cleared offshore wind at £94 a megawatt hour. Now, the average price of generating electricity with gas in 2025 was £80 per megawatt hour, and that's with about 28% of that now being carbon costs, because carbon costs more than doubled over the course of 2025, because Keir Starmer wants to harmonise the UK carbon market with the EU carbon market ahead of the implementation of the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And so this is just crazy extra cost. Now that they've now made these subsidies 20 years instead of 15 years previously. So if you actually worked out what that would have been on a 15-year basis, it would be something like £104, £105 a megawatt hour. So significantly more expensive than the cost of generating electricity with gas. Now, yes, if you were going to have to build a new gas power station, that would cost you more, because we're talking about depreciated assets now for that £80. But if you took away the carbon pricing, then that would be much lower. And so it's not apples, it's apples and oranges the way they look at this. But the other big thing is that that's just the first order subsidy. Then they get a massive hidden subsidy because their connections get paid for. So if you want to drill a new oil or gas well in the North Sea, you have to build and pay for the pipeline that brings that oil and gas into the market. If you build a wind farm in the North Sea, then the consumers will pay for the wires to bring that electricity to the market. So huge hidden subsidy worth billions of pounds. Then you have the cost of backup, again, billions of pounds a year. And you have the cost of managing real-time intermittency. And then just in case that wasn't enough, we keep building wind farms in places where there's not enough grid infrastructure. And so we have to pay them to turn off as well. And that's also billions of pounds a year. Seagreen is the worst example. Opened in October 23. In 2024, it got curtailed 2/3 of the time. In 2025, that went up to 3/4 of the time. It is a massive waste of money.
Wow. I'm sitting here. I've got about 9,000 questions, Kathryn, and this is a fabulous report. But I have several questions. You've got. Let me go through let me kind of frame the network here. You've got the grid, the electrification of EVs and heat pumps at the forefront at the consumer level, trying to demand more electricity. Then you had the AI data centers that you just mentioned were going to behind the meter and using natural gas. And then you have the war on oil, getting rid of all of the natural gas for UK oil companies in the North Sea. So you're going to be relying on Norway in order to get your natural gas. I see some real problems between that dichotomy of consumer electrification with using Japan's electric cars, or you see the new world order that Kearney wants is going to be really kind of interesting. This is a mess.
So it's interesting that I've been in a number of meetings recently where people are outright saying that they think Ed Miliband is, a Chinese agent, because it's so hard to actually develop some kind of a logic for his behavior, because it's so destructive to the British economy that it only kind of makes sense if he's acting on behalf of a hostile power. Now, I actually don't think that's the case. I think that's probably taking things a bit far.
Logically, Kathryn, in the United States, I have that question of Governor Newsom. I have
John Kerry.
Do what?
John Kerry, Al Gore. Same
John,
thing.
But the difference is the governor of a California state has single-handedly created a national security risk for the entire West Coast by his war on oil. And you have to wonder, I'd ask, follow the money. Is he tied to China's money? I don't know that. I'm not accusing him, but it sure looks funny.
Yeah, well, I'm more inclined to believe stuff is cock up rather than conspiracy. But it's just an interesting place to be, where you've got policymakers whose policies are so destructive that people are openly speculating whether they're traitors, because you can't actually think of a realistic, reasonable, and rational explanation.
Is it better to be corrupt or stupid?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? I think it's probably better to be corrupt, actually.
Yeah, very Hobbesian choice there.
Yeah.
They get to make it for themselves.
Steve had a real question here that I wanted to go through. He had two comments. I don't know that I understood this one. The 2022 ESP Pathfinder 2 focused on inertia short-circuited specifically for Scotland. 2 projects were grid formatting inverters and the rest synchronous condensers. And then a follow-up question from him wasn't the issue in Spain that the thermal generators didn't have their run-through voltage limits set correctly?
Yeah, that was just one of many problems. But the biggest problem in Spain was the inverter-based generation not meeting fault ride-through requirements. So I'll take the Spain one first. You had a grid fault that was caused by a malfunctioning inverter. Now, I think that's you get grid faults. In this particular case, it was caused by an inverter, but faults will happen all the time anyway. In response to that voltage disturbance, you were supposed to have both synchronous generators and inverter-based generation were supposed to then provide voltage support. Neither did that properly. It wasn't just thermal generation, it was wind and solar as well. There was widespread non-compliance by all types of generation. So then the grid operator did manage they did a bunch of other stuff, stabilize the situation, but the grid was still pretty weak. And more or less at the same time, you had a large amount of distribution connected solar disconnect for price reasons, because prices went negative in the middle of the day. Now that caused a drop in frequency. And because the grid was so weak, then a whole load of inverter-based generation tripped. Now this was the primary failure that brought down the Spanish grid. It was the inverter-based generation not meeting a frequency fault ride-through condition under the grid code. So they tripped off when frequency was still within the range at which they were supposed to ride through. Now, all of those, primarily solar farms then tripping off, caused the frequency to fall outside the operational limits. And at that point, thermal started tripping off and that wasn't a code violation because the frequency had fallen by then too much for it to be expected to withstand and ride through. Once you started getting those thermal generators tripping off from a frequency fault, then that caused that's what caused the cascade then happened from there on. So what brought down the Spanish grid was non-compliance with fault ride-through obligations of inverter-based generation, not thermal generation. It's really important that people understand that. Nobody complied properly with their voltage support requirements, but when that happened, the grid was then recovered, but it was still in a weakened state. The disconnection of the solar for price reasons, and that wasn't a fault, that was just normal market stuff, in the context of a weak grid, then to cause the drop in frequency, and the inverters didn't cope with that drop in frequency. And so this was what brought down the grid. It was inverter-based generation not meeting their fault ride-through obligations. And there's an awful lot of greens out there that keep trying to muddy the waters on this. This is not, it was because of inverter-based generation. Inverters were the reason the Spanish grid broke.
So that goes back to AC versus DC then, just the basic, so a plain old country boy can understand it, asynchronous versus DC, and you got that in there.
Yeah, so then that brings to the second point, and the Pathfinders. Yes, the Pathfinders are trying to come up with ways of managing this situation, but grid forming power electronics do not anywhere in the world form the grid. Yes, there are some installed in Australia, but they are not forming the grid. Transgrid wrote a report in 2023 warning that there's too little data around how grid forming electronics interact with protection relays on the grid. Right. There is still a lot of where AMO has said, well, we can't figure out the economic frameworks for this because anytime you want the inverters to do something for grid support, they need a load of money for it because they can only do it if they take current away from powering loads. So yes, you have these initiatives, that's true, but it doesn't mean they're delivering anything useful. And I don't know that even with synchronous condensers provide you with grid support, but they don't form the grid because they're not generating electricity. So I don't know whether you can operate the Scottish grid in the absence of Peterhead and Torness just with electronics and synchronous condensers. That might work to stabilize things in the south of Scotland, but the more you go, the further north you go, the more difficult it's going to be to control voltage.
This is a great Aslan pilot car. Stupid versus corrupt determines the length of the sentence. I love that. That to me is a great one. And then we have MD Bone here. Since leaving the EU, isn't the UK free to make more sensible energy decisions? What's the purpose of Brexit if fossil fuels and fertilizers are more unusable? I have a feeling that Herr Starmer is looking at moving back to and getting rid of Brexit. And
well, he's not officially trying to get rid of Brexit.
Not officially.
What he's trying to do is do it through the back door, so you end up with the worst of both worlds, where you get no democratic input whatsoever, but you have to follow all the rules
and make the payments.
Honestly, the sooner this Labour government is out of office, the better. Because they are betraying the British people left, right, and centre. They've already betrayed their historical constituency of blue-collar workers. They're just hammering them with unbelievable new taxes and new regulation. I mean, they keep having to backtrack because it's so like they came up with this new tax on farmers. You've got pubs closing at a rate of knots. The hospitality industry more broadly is being destroyed. Then you've got Miliband destroying in industry with high energy prices, and every so often they sort of realize that, like Grangemouth, they've just decided to give some financial support to the refinery, because it's like, oh yes, we know, actually we just realized that ethylene is quite important, so maybe we should make sure we can still make some. It's just they are so nobody really in the cabinet has any business experience. They're all either lawyers, trade unionists.
It's like the Obama administration in the United States. No business people.
So they see business as this other that they can tax. It's like a bottomless well of tax receipts. And they don't understand that if they put up taxes, well, the well might run dry, or the owner of the well might just decide to pack it in and go move somewhere else, or just do something else. And we're actually at a point now, if you look at welfare, that it's broadly a one-for-one relationship between people in work paying taxes and people in receipt of state benefits, whether that's a pension or some form of welfare. So this is not a sustainable situation. It's why people like me are thinking about leaving the country. My husband isn't very keen, which is why I haven't done it yet. And that's actually quite worrying, because if you look at the migration statistics now, we're getting a lot of unskilled illegal immigrants entering the country and getting looked after better than disadvantaged British people. I think that's why people are getting so upset about it. If you are a homeless single mother, that you will get put in some temporary accommodation, it won't be very nice, and that's really it. And British people now, if they want to access medical care, they probably have to wait a month or so to see a family doctor. And it's almost impossible to get state-funded dental care, even though notionally it's supposed to be available. But these illegal immigrants, they get put in 4-star hotels, they get given a nice navy blue polo jacket, they get given a mobile phone, they get same-day access to free medical and dental care. And so people are like, these people are here illegally and they get better stuff than everyone else. Why don't I just hop over to France, rip up my passport, and then come back on the boat, and then I can get this nice stuff as well?
Well, we've had that in the United States as well.
Yeah.
Same exact phenomenon.
I'm not sure it's quite so in your face, though.
Well, in certain cities, it has
so
been.
much nice
it's pretty bad.
Access to the healthcare and the dental care as well. That's quite a big deal. It's an area that British people are struggling with normally, and so unless you can afford to go privately, it's very difficult to get timely healthcare. So when you see illegal immigrants getting it same day,
I think we're about to find out how bad the United States was when we find out that Somalia, the billions of dollars that Tim Walz, that Obama let all the Somalis into one area, and then the corruption that followed that. Governor Newsom in California said, Tim, I see your corruption, hold my beer, and we're about to see about how bad California's corruption is. So
I've got a question about the gas grid. You mentioned that and this is happening in the U.S. too, I think, and to a large extent, the data centers are probably not going to get their power from the power grid. They're going to be on the gas grid, right, in the UK. And I wonder, is the gas grid in the UK adequately supplied and modernized to handle this additional load from the data centers?
Well, yes, because the impacts of deindustrialization obviously it hits the gas grid as well. So you'll just get substitution. And there are actually some significant upgrades to gas infrastructure in the pipeline, shall we say, if you'll excuse the pun, because we started taking so much LNG and we have two big import terminals in the south of Wales, in Pembroke, Southhook and Pembroke are next to each other. Then they're building new high pressure pipeline capacity to go west to east to bring that gas into England. So that's already in progress. And what my report looks at in terms of the gas grid is actually the offshore pipeline networks, because we have all of the UK gas and a chunk of the Norwegian gas comes through a set of pipelines that are owned and operated by Britain. And there are actually only two independent pipelines from Gasco into like the Norwegian pipeline system and onto the British beach. Those pipelines require a certain throughput to remain both physically and economically viable. And as you decline North Sea production, then the throughput on some of those pipelines starts to decline to a point where it's not potentially viable anymore. And I have a chart in the report. It's on page 61.
I was looking for it. Thank you.
Figure 20.
60 what?
Yeah, 61.
Okay, great.
Yeah. This one at the bottom there. And so it's showing the status, if you like, of the gas and liquids pipeline systems. Now, we've already had INEOS, which owns the Forties pipeline, that's a big liquids pipeline system, saying that the volumes going through there are starting to look suspect, and they might have to shut it down. And then, of course, what happens is that all of the official forecasts for North Sea output show this very smooth decline in the coming decades. But if you end up having pipeline systems closing, then any field that ties back into that system will be forced into decommissioning, whether it could continue to produce or not. So actually, you'll start getting steps instead of the smooth curve. Now, NESO put out so our system operator put out a report actually on the same day as the autumn budget, so it didn't really get much attention, saying that in the coming years, we might just not have enough gas on cold winter days. Now, National Gas, which operates the high pressure transmission system, has been saying that this risk could. So yeah, there it is at the bottom there, the pipes, the circles. National Gas has even been saying that this risk might manifest as early as next winter. I think that's a bit soon, but it's going to be something that comes in the next few years if we don't reverse the decline in the North Sea production. So for that, we need a more friendly fiscal regime and to reverse the ban on drilling. But otherwise, we would see shortages on cold winter days. So what does that look like? Ultimately, all of these things could potentially lead us into a system of rationing, which is what we experienced in the 1970s. To mitigate this risk, the only other thing you could do would be to put in floating regas, and the spare pipeline capacity at Easington and St Fergus, but you still have to build all the ship handling and the storage tanks and all the rest of it. So it's not straightforward. Yes, it can be done, and it can be done relatively quickly. I think Germany showed us that. But again, you can't be complacent about it. And this is really, I think, at the heart of my report is that there's too much complacency around our legacy assets. And I identified 12 gigawatts of at-risk gas generation, and that's also, I can give you the page number for that. A couple of pages before, that's on page 53. And there's a table there showing the power stations that I think are the most at risk of closure. We might not lose all 12 gigawatts, but we really can't afford to lose more than 2 or 3. So it's not a case of, and I'm not claiming that all 12 gigawatts is going to close. I'm just saying that we have so many old power stations, and also the way they're being used. So with the utilization rates falling, that actually, combined cycle gas turbines are not designed to work on that basis. And so if you don't run your CCGT sort of once a week, you'll start getting into, you'll start experiencing issues with your boiler chemistry, for example, which will then lead to reliability concerns. So you're taking very old assets and trying to push them into an operating regime that they were never designed for.
Yeah.
And then you're expecting that nothing's going to go wrong. It just doesn't seem very sensible to me. So my report is really saying, don't be complacent. We have these risks. Our legacy assets are not just in the sort of shape that you can just do what you like with them and expect everything to be fine.
I want to just throw out there some of the critics, because whenever you have a report, there's always these critics who come in and say stuff like, oh, well, flexibility measures like smart charging will mitigate the overload. And we can have these AI data centers that will actually be useful in helping with the rationing, because there was this idea floated that they'll read your meter every 30 minutes and they'll use dynamic pricing to shift the demand, so that if you see that you're getting charged 30p per kilowatt hour because you're in a high demand period of 30 minutes, you'll shut stuff off, and therefore the load will be managed by this AI that will be monitoring everybody's meter every 30 minutes and adjusting depending on demand. So how would you respond to critics who say that this is the solution, that there's this new tech that will help manage everything and help keep the grid from falling apart or having blackouts and stuff?
I would say it's deluded. Well, first of all, only just under half of homes even have a smart meter to begin with. And about a tenth or so of the ones that do, the smart meter doesn't work properly. So then you have an immediate issue of access to that technology. Secondly, the grid, utilities are supposed to serve consumers and not the other way around. So there's a fundamental disconnect there between the purpose of the grid and what you're now suggesting, that you'll suggest, essentially saying that people need to change the way they live their lives so the grid doesn't fall over, rather than just expanding the grid to assist people in the way they want to live their lives.
Right.
And the people who will be most harmed by that will be those on lower incomes, because they're going to be the ones who are motivated. And in 2022, NISO introduced something called a demand flexibility service. And at the time, they were actually offering a fair amount of money for it. Now it's not really worth anything, but at the time they were offering a fair amount of money. And they so that people could get paid to reduce their consumption during these hours that have been identified. Now, you had a whole load of really rich, privileged people who figured out how they could game the system by boosting their consumption in the observation window where it was calibrated. And so they went and started heating up their swimming pools and charging their cars and doing everything they could to make their consumption higher, so that when they actually got to the delivery window, they would, even just normal consumption, look like a big saving. And they made loads of money on that. I was doing lots of radio phone-ins at the time, hearing heartbreaking stories of people going and sitting in their car for an hour, sitting at home with every light turned off, all the heating off, everything, literally sitting in bed with their phones for an hour to try and huddle together to keep warm, and just do that for an hour. And they were saving pennies. This was the heartbreaking thing, was that because these people were already disadvantaged, and bills were high, they'd already cut their consumption. They couldn't go and charge up a car and heat their swimming pool during the calibration period. And so they were experiencing real hardship for very little gain.
So aren't you really touching on right here? And this is going to get into the conspiracy versus the stupidity argument, right? Isn't this actually what you're talking about here? The central objective, it always has been, of the global climate alarm movement to force people to live smaller, more compact lives and invoke this process of power rationing, shortages all over the place that inevitably is going to impact the poorest among us the hardest, right? This has always been the central objective of Agenda 2030.
I mean, I don't know that I really buy into that. It just seems...
Oh, come on. It obviously is. It obviously is. I mean, Bill McKibben has written books about it. Okay.
But that doesn't make it true. Like, it doesn't make it true. It's okay. Those people who would be living those smaller lives, they're not the people who consume all the energy to start
right.
with.
No,
so So I don't know. I don't buy into that.
It's hard to believe Ed Miliband is so ignorant he doesn't understand that. It's really impossible.
I think Ed Miliband is a very rigid thinker, and that he's got into a particular rut and cannot be diverted from that rut. And I suspect also that he's persuaded himself that anybody that doesn't agree with him is themselves corrupt, that they're being paid for by big oil and whatever. So I think when you come into something and it starts to acquire the characteristics of a religion, then people will behave like religious fanatics. And I think that's a more reasonable explanation for what's happening here. And it's also not the first time. If you think back to the European Protestant Reformation and the abuses that you saw with the Spanish Inquisition, for example, people believed very sincerely that if you didn't profess what they deemed to be the true faith, you would burn for in hell. And if you believe that sincerely, then you would justify doing just about any horrible thing to them to get them to say they believe in the true faith. So they went around torturing people. They subjected people to horrific abuses in the name of religion because they thought they were saving their immortal soul. Now, we obviously look back on that and think it's crazy, but this was a secretly held belief. And so it's entirely possible that human beings in large numbers persuade themselves of things that other groups of human beings will look at and go, that's just nuts. And I think we're more in that kind of territory with this rather than a genuine conspiracy that's deliberately setting out to harm people for some sort of an economic or political objective, which I think is the whole make people poor model. I think what we're seeing here is a type of religious fanaticism, and we need to, it needs to stop basically in the same way the Spanish Inquisition had to stop. I think we've actually passed peak. We've passed peak woke. We've passed, I think, peak critical race theory. We've passed peak net zero. And I also think that a lot of the change that we're going to see is going to be driven by economic reality, because if you look at the sort of post-war orthodoxy, we've seen massive expansion of the state across Western economies to try and do things nicely, to start paying more welfare, to hugely increase regulation because we want to have, equality and we want to look after the environment and all of these things. And what started out as reasonable adjustments at the end of the Cold War have become really sort of got out of control. So you take sort of gender discrimination as one example. Of course, we don't want to see gender discrimination in business. We want women to have equal opportunities to get hired, to get promotion. That's kind of a good thing. But we just had this some sort of an aspiration document published in Britain, which nuclear developers are supposed to sign up to, which says that they want to see 50% female participation in nuclear supply chains. Now, this is like just crazy. Like, we're not going to see 50% female participation in nuclear supply chains anytime soon. I would prefer to have 0 women working in nuclear if we can get nuclear power stations built, than 0 nuclear power stations but 50% women in the supply chain. Because the priority actually is to build the generation, and we've lost sight of that, I think. But actually, we're coming to the point where productivity's fallen so much, where debt and government borrowings increased so much that this is going to have to change because it's no longer affordable. And economists are talking about a credible risk that multiple Western economies will see sovereign debt crises in the coming years. I think France is probably at the top of that list. Britain's not far behind. Even Germany is being spoken of in those terms. And so that, combined with the fact that actually voters have also run out of patience with this, and again, it's not just in one country, you're seeing it in multiple countries where the traditional parties are falling out of favor. And in Britain, you've got reform that people talk about as being right wing. It's actually not especially right wing when you look at their policies. They're just kind of right wing on immigration, they're kind of left wing on everything else. Then you've got Jeremy Corbyn setting up his new thing on the left, and the Greens as well, very strongly left wing party. You've got AfD in Germany. So you're seeing these. You've got the Farmers' Party in the Netherlands, again, come out of nowhere, really, to be a not insignificant bloc within the Dutch Parliament. So you're seeing these changes in the political landscape. And I think that, combined with the fact that we're all running out of money, will be the sort of dominant theme in the coming years. And a lot of this stuff will just fall away because it won't be affordable.
I wanted to address a couple of things that were said in the questions and what Kathryn's been saying here as we kind of wind up. So with respect to Brexit, someone asked, well, I thought UK could do their own policy now because of Brexit or whatever. But, when the Conservatives lost that vote, and then they had the election, and then Conservatives came in, Theresa May did everything she could to drag her feet to not do it. Then Boris came in saying, I promise I'll do it, but then doubled down on net zero. So the Conservatives were just as much to blame for setting up all this stuff that the Labour had set up back in 2008, 2009 with the Climate Change Committee, and then it morphed into net zero. And, Brexit, you're right. It was supposed to have a rational energy policy that we no longer had to listen to what the EU was doing and all their crazy green taxes and everything. And they just doubled down on net zero. And so I think part of the frustration of people is that they vote for parties that say they're going to do something, and then the parties don't do it. And then they're like, well, why aren't they listening to us? We need to set up something new, which is why you see the rise of reform, because every party says we're going to handle immigration, never happens. Said they're going to do stuff with the grid to make it better, don't do it. And with respect to what Kathryn says, that, about this kind of religious idea around green and net zero and everything, I think part of the problem with someone like Ed Miliband, as Kathryn accurately portrayed it, he's got this kind of one-track mind that it's going to work. And everybody around him says, this is going to work. We're not trying hard enough. Big oil is sponsoring critics like Kathryn. I wish, right?
I wish too, yeah.
And it's like, there are all these people who are just delay the transition. And if only they would stop putting these rational things forward, the delay wouldn't happen and we could actually do this stuff. Because they believe, these people around Ed Miliband and so on, they believe that somehow this will work if they just try harder. And they ignore reality. So I think there's some people like Bill McKibben who push net zero, and there's other people who really want people to live smaller lives and everything. And there's lots of people in the Climate Change Committee who believe that too. But it's a competition between those who, I'm saying it's not necessarily mutually exclusive. There's people who seek to pursue that policy objective of having people live smaller lives because it'll save the planet or whatever. And then other people who are like, no, I really think we can do the transition. And they're in alignment with that direction, though their motivations might be different.
And so Ed Miliband is going to live a smaller life by going to Brazil twice because he left his electric vehicle running in the parking lot. The man is one step short of being a sock puppet. I mean, this is absolutely horrific. This is also a very good description as the United States is facing many of the same things. We have a uniparty system. I used to be, great points, Tammy, by the way. MD Bone is pointing that out as well, too. We have a uniparty. We have the same party It's just there's only about four politicians in Washington that are honorable.
So we've had a change in Britain that I think hasn't really received the attention it deserved. So if you look at Brexit, the 2016 vote was very close, and the establishment didn't believe the results. They basically thought that if they ran it again, it would be a different result. And it wasn't until the 2019 election, when the Conservatives came back with a big majority, that that question was put to bed. But then 2 months later, you had COVID. And so there was then no opportunity to enact a proper Brexit. So then everything went off the rails with COVID. And you also have to keep in mind that when the Conservatives came in 2010, there was no money. I mean, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, the outgoing Labour Chief Secretary to the Treasury, actually left a note on his desk that said, sorry, there's no money left. So the Conservatives came in a financial crisis, and they went out in another crisis. Now, when Boris was replaced with Sunak, and I never really liked Sunak, and I really understood what he was for, but he did try and start putting in change. So he appointed Claire Coutinho into the Energy Ministry. And one of the first things that she did was ask officials to calculate the full system cost of all different types of generation instead of just looking at levelized costs. Now, they didn't do it, and then Miliband cancelled it when he came in. But the Conservatives had in 2023 realised that they did need to change. And so I think that was the start of it not being a uni party anymore, that Labour had been moving leftwards. And yes, under Starmer, they were trying to come a little bit back from the fringes of Corbyn. But the Conservatives genuinely started thinking that they needed to become Conservatives again instead of Liberals, which is kind of where they'd ended up. And so I think under Kemi Badenoch now, the Conservatives are rediscovering their natural conservatism. And I think that they're right when they characterise Reform as not being a right-wing party. Reform is seen as being right-wing because they are anti-immigration. But if you look at economic policies, they're more socialist. And so, I mean, I actually think the Conservatives win the next election because I think it all comes down to the economy. And people might not like voting for them, but I think they'll vote for them in the sense of it being the least likely to mess everything up. And eventually the Conservatives are seen as being more safe when it comes to economic matters. But they're doing the work as well. I mean, I work quite a lot with Claire and her team, and they've gone back to first principles. They said, okay, what was happening before? It didn't. And the other thing is they were completely misled and lied to by officials. So their civil servants were giving them bad information. When they left office, that was when they really realised just how bad it was. And so you have a civil service which is unaccountable. And this goes to the point about delivery as well. The government doesn't actually run the country because they've delegated so many powers to arm's length bodies. And this whole situation in Birmingham with the football match is really indicative of that. So you had a football match between a local team and an Israeli team. And the police decided that they would ban the Israeli fans. And they came up with all these arguments about how they were hooligans, which they claimed had come from Dutch police intelligence. And then that turned out to be completely false. At the time the ban was announced, the Home Secretary and the Prime Minister said it was terrible and they didn't agree with it and they didn't want the ban to happen. But they had to admit that they didn't have operational control over the police and they couldn't make them remove the ban. So the match went ahead, the Israeli football fans were excluded, and then this chief of police has been brought in front of Parliament twice. Then it turns out he misled Parliament because he was using AI to come up with his information and it was wrong. And then they couldn't get rid of him. The Home Secretary wanted him to be fired, but she didn't have the power to do it. So she stood up in Parliament, she said, I'm going to say something that no Home Secretary said in decades. I do not have confidence in this police chief. But she could not remove him. The only person who could remove him was the local police commissioner, who was a left-wing Corbynist who didn't want to. And then eventually this guy got shamed into resigning. But this illustrates the extent to which the government has lost control of the apparatus of state. And so when people say, oh, well, you know, I voted for X and they didn't deliver and I voted for Y and they didn't deliver. Well, this is because they can't deliver because the system is now geared in a way. You know, ministers can't fire civil servants or hire them. So if a minister like Claire continues, so please calculate the cost of, the full system cost of generation, they don't do it. She can't make them. So right. in order to actually get anything done, we're going to need to have a wide scale reform of the apparatus of state and the governance that goes with that. And to restore accountability, you have to restore power, because at the moment you don't have power. So you vote people in, they can't really do anything. And even Labour's admitted this.
We have run out of time.
The government doesn't run the country.
I'm afraid.
Yeah, but the bureaucracy is in alignment with Labour, I think, more than conservatives.
We've got that.
Yeah, that's true, but it's still not exclusively.
Am I muted?
You're not muted. We still hear you. Okay. And you still look terrible. So
we're out of time.
Yeah, we're out of time.
There we go, Kathryn. I want you to tell everybody where they can find you in your report. I forgot to do that up front, so please let everyone know where they can find you.
Well, you could just Google my name. My business is called Watt Logic. Watt as in unit of power, and the report's on my website. It's in the blog section, yes. So it's pretty easy to find.
Yes, and it's Watt dash logic.
Hyphen,
right?
Yeah.
Hyphen logic, yes. And you're on X, I know. I follow you on X.
Yeah, Kathryn Porter 26 on both X and LinkedIn.
All right, good deal. Everyone, thank you all for joining us. All these wonderful questions and comments, appreciate it. I'm sorry I got a little lost there at the end, but we'll have you back soon to talk about the rest of what we left out today, Kathryn.
Yeah, I'd be delighted.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a wonderful week.
Thanks, Kathryn.
Thank you, Stu.
Bye.